Today I'm returning to the world and characters of Final Fantasy X, with a slightly more involved look at the enigmatic creature known as Sin. Now, there are many aspects of Final Fantasy X that distinguished it from what came before, and as covered in my recent review, nudged the series in a new direction, graphically, technologically, and gameplay-wise, from which it has never looked back. But one of the lesser discussed novelties of the title is how it distributes the antagonism and obstacles of our heroes across a spectrum of characters, and Sin in particular, which is the definitive destructive force that has helped shape the despairing world of Spira, is very interesting in its role here as an indiscriminate force of nature rather than an overt central villain with schemes and plots and intent. So through the passage of time, I've come to appreciate what a unique contribution this creature is to the world of Final Fantasy X. And in this episode, I'm going to touch on some of these elements, how it heightens the story and works alongside characters such as Tidus, Yuna, Seymour, and Auron to build an intriguing world of many moving parts. So, jumping right in, the creature known as Sin is very much at the centre of Final Fantasy X and the world of Spira. Such is its perpetuity that an entire civilization and theocratic institution has been built up around it, creating a ceaseless purgatorial cycle and cultural ecosystem of never-ending hope and despair. This, in and of itself, is a fantastic set piece for Final Fantasy X, and one of the more unique backdrops the writing team has ventured to create, I think. But beyond this, Sin is interesting because, despite being the central destructive force in the game that has so disrupted and shaped and destroyed mankind, one struggles to really call it an antagonist. And indeed, as mentioned already, by the time we encounter it, it is much more an elemental, indiscriminate automaton than it is a vindictive villain with any particular agenda. And when we look at this a little more closely, really considering the origins of Sin and how it came to exist at all, I think it represents, like Tidus and Yuna, the protagonists, and indeed Seymour, the prominent villain in the game, part of an underlying theme of Final Fantasy X, which is the idea of the sins of the father, which I discussed way back in my Jecht episode, and how reckless, ill-advised, and indeed tragic events of the past have echoed out and shaped the events of the present. While Tidus and his father issues are front and centre with his personal arc in the game, and Seymour's own father issues simmer away quietly in the subtext if we go looking for it, and finally Yuna's loss of Braska form this triumvirate of paternal loss between the three of them and sort of interestingly unite them, Sin and the cycle of Sin roots back to its elusive progenitor, Yu Yevon, who sets events in motion by attempting to destroy Bevelle and preserve Zanarkand by creating the Faith. Indeed, if we consider that Lady Yunalesca, who we meet towards the end of Final Fantasy X, is Yu Yevon's daughter and became the first summoner to defeat Sin, we can see that this paternal strife and sins of the father theme roots all the way back to the very origins of the creature Sin, and Yu Yevon's actions in life, his original sin, if you like, and this creation of the creature, is thus emblematic of the human follies, the paternal issues, which are so prevalent in the game, and this history that's doomed to repeat itself, that very much governs the world of Spira. So, this stuff is interesting, and the Machina War between Zanarkand and Bevelle, which returns to the recurring Final Fantasy theme of nature and magic against technology, the subsequent formation of Yevon, which interpreted these historic events a certain way. It's all very interesting and sound context for the story, which could be discussed at length on its own. But in keeping with Sin, and considering the villainy in Final Fantasy X around this historical context, I really like that actually you are hard pushed to say there is an inherent evil in this game, even accounting for Seymour, who is the closest thing we get to a concerted, wanton villain. You know, he might be considered a tragic character, looked at a certain way. And looking back to the father figures, particularly Yu Yevon, Jecht, and Jiskel, the latter of which confesses in his recording that he wasn't strong enough to help his son, what we see is again the follies and the foolishness of humankind, kind of creating these situations that echo out across later generations and which people in the present and the future have to deal with. And that was a very interesting approach that distinguishes Final Fantasy X among its peers, I think. And uniquely for a Final Fantasy, explores complex father-son relationships to a degree that other games don't. So, moving on, there's a lot of symbolism that's often remarked upon, and particularly biblical allegory in Final Fantasy X, of which sin is a significant part. And indeed, the name, being the most obvious one, refers to moral transgressions against God, and in practice too, sin is considered a punishment among the Yevonites of Spira for their pridefulness, and in particular the use of Machina technology. And this is interesting because, much like the biblical tales of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and more famously the Great Flood, where Noah built his ark, there's this recurring idea of human pride prompting divine retribution, and sin wreaking havoc upon the world, and Yevon's reasoning behind that, and urging of repentance, and a certain ascetic selflessness, is very much in keeping with this kind of biblical allegory, which I found quite interesting, if a little on the nose. But looking more specifically at the game, and the other metaphorical implications of sin, I always really liked how the creature represents and can be interpreted as different things to different people. It's a very abstract and mysterious thing, and while for most Spirans it is taken literally as the monstrous whale purging them for their sins, for other characters, most specifically Tidus, it can be considered representative of his personal arc and his underlying issues with his father, this overwhelming anger and trauma he's carried around since childhood, and the father figure that he's built up as a monster inside his mind is manifest in the metaphor of sin. And what drives the point home a little bit more is, of course, that Jecht is in fact present inside the monster. So the macro plot of Spira in danger from a monster, and the metaphorical father as monster personal plight of Tidus, both resolve at this single point, and his abandonment issues reconcile at the same point as, the world is saved, which is the final showdown with the eponymous creature, Sin. Finally, a lesser and perhaps slightly more unhinged view of sin is the certain reverence and perceived salvation seen by Seymour Guado, and in his nihilistic worldview, where to live is to suffer, and thus death would end all suffering. Sin is the vehicle for his grand plan and his agenda, and so he aspires towards this creature with a certain reverence in order to achieve that. So, moving on, and my final point before wrapping up is considering both the narrative pacing around sin and its peculiar physiology and anatomy that make it both bizarre and alluring as an entrant to Final Fantasy lore, and even by the standards of Final Fantasy, which is generally pretty far out at times. Sin does stand distinct among many of the antagonistic forces in these games, I think. And the reason I combine these two factors of narrative pacing and the physicality of the creature is that the abstract anatomy and imposing presence of sin is intrinsic to the gradual build and layering of the game story. And much like Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, who, in my opinion, had one of the best paced villain arcs in any given game, particularly a JRPG game of that era. And I've discussed that at length elsewhere. But much like Sephiroth and the escalating mystique of Sephiroth in FF7, Sin is sporadically alluded to and hinted at and fleetingly glimpsed by the player through the first act of the game. And it has a reputation that precedes it. Our idea of Sin is built up by Aurin's comments or the fear of the citizens of Spira and their comments. So this really adds to the tense atmosphere of the setting, but also the imposing, intimidating and unseen nature of the creature, which never really reveals itself until right towards the end of the game. So, unlike the Sephiroth build, what's interesting about Sin's appearances is that it does recur throughout the early game story. And indeed, it debuts in the first 10 minutes of the game in the surrealist cataclysm that pulls Tidus out of Zanarkand and into Spira. Shortly after that, when travelling to Kilika from Besaid, we have a minor boss battle with its Finn, and then we witness it in an FMV sequence, destroying Kilika village. But despite these early appearances, it is still concealed and it's still mysterious. We only ever glimpse aspects of it, whether it's a fin or its hump-like back with parts of Zanarkand sticking out of it at Kilika and Mihen, or indeed the Sin spawn that periodically detach and, attack stuff. So it's very mysterious and concealed and abstract. And so the gradual revealing of sin is synonymous with the reveals of story. And as Tidus discovers the truth about Jecht and Zanarkand, for example, and the party discovers the truth about Yevon and the final summoning, we see and understand more of sin. And this comes to its climax when we arrive at the Zanarkand ruins. And as Tidus monologues about seeing the city with his own eyes, he turns around to see sin in its entirety, looking out over the ruins at him. Quite a freaky moment, actually. And I think this is symbolic, perhaps, because now the full truth of the story, and specifically Tidus' story, is revealed, so too is the entirety of the creature. So the anatomy and physiology of sin is pretty cool, and I love that even as we learn more about it, it never shakes the fundamental mysteries and absurdities of its being. And once we do finally see it in its entirety, it takes to flying around instead of swimming, and it grows these wing-like appendages once the airship shoots its fins off. And then climactically, of course, we venture inside it for some final battles, which is some sort of quantum realm containing stars and galaxies and space, which is bound, I suppose, to the creature's recurring use of time magic and gravity magic, which again is fitting, being one of those more abstract magics to appear in Final Fantasy. So there's a constant escalation and progression to the creature's unfathomable weirdness and magnitude that really does it justice. And without wishing to labour on the point, the penultimate FMV, where Sin attacks the airship and just carves these cylindrical holes through the planet, it just attests to this extinction level power that it wields, and is a really cool element to its character, and as I say, this kind of building escalation of its force and its magnitude. And as I touched on in my earlier Final Fantasy X review, there's just something epic about Sin that recalls this Japanese heritage of Godzilla and the King Kong adaptations and the massive city-destroying creatures that's just very much part and parcel of that pop culture. So Sin brings in a bit of that. It brings in a bit of mysteries of the deep, and as I mentioned, the sort of Cthulhu mythos, and it just blends it very seamlessly and very well into this unique Final Fantasy world. So I felt it warranted an episode because it's not often discussed in isolation, but really did do a lot to distinguish Final Fantasy X. So there we have it, my thoughts on Final Fantasy X's bizarre antagonistic obstacle known as Sin, a being that subsumes the personal antagonist of Jecht and is sought out by the macro-antagonist of Seymour. And as I say, a powerfully unique entrant to the Final Fantasy universe. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And drop a comment below, let me know your thoughts and reactions to the creature known as Sin.